When I started drawing consistently as an adult, my earliest drawings were all in pencil. It started on a trip to Europe in 2018, where I sat in the street and I drew some of the architecture, magnificent architecture around me. As well as being satisfied creatively, it was a wonderful way to take in the city in all its fullness. It didn't really matter what city I was in. There were amazing things to draw. So these are all freehand location sketches. When I came back to Australia, I didn't want to stop. But my drawings were no longer freehand. I would do a 4x4 grid on some of my travel photos on the paper, and I'd use those to help me transfer my pencil outlines, and then I would go over the top with more detail, erasing the grid at some stage. I found this a very satisfying technique to use, and one that produced results that I was very happy with. I believed it let me do a level of detail that I wouldn't be able to achieve any other way. But I began to see and admire ink drawings on Instagram and began to want to try and capture that wonderful black and white crispness. And so I began to experiment carefully, slowly, drawing directly in pen without any pencil. And I discovered that some subjects, while they looked quite complex at the end, because they were very geometric, I was able to progress them relatively accurately bit by bit. And this became the foundation of a way of drawing directly in ink. And when I began to draw in making YouTube videos, I decided to do it exclusively freehand in ink. And I discovered that from fairly rudimentary beginnings, the way I was developing to draw could translate quite well into fairly complex drawings and have a remarkable degree of accuracy even without grids, without pencil, without erasing anything at all. I began to be as much concerned about capturing the effect of the architecture as the precision of it. In fact, capturing effect became more and more my focus in what I drew. And this was particularly helpful as we moved away from architecture to more natural subjects, even ones that were quite complex. And as my boldness and confidence in drawing directly in ink grew, I became more adventurous in the sorts of effects, the sorts of visual impact, the sense of visual drama that I've been trying to capture. And I found that it's opened up possibilities for me in drawing that I don't believe I would ever have got to if I'd continued drawing in pencil. And in all honesty, a lot of the most obvious benefits came because drawing directly in ink, without any pencil underdrawing, I could no longer use an eraser. I couldn't draw the same way, and I couldn't draw with the same mindset. And this in itself forced me to flick lots of switches in my mind. It forced me to switch a lot of the ways I thought and a lot of the techniques I used. It forced me to do a lot of things differently. And it simply forced me to have to think harder and in many ways more creatively about my drawing process, my drawing intent, and the drawing outcome that I was trying to get to. All of these things were incredibly stimulating when I look back to every aspect of my creative journey. But with my pencil background, I certainly appreciate that when someone suggests that we draw directly in ink with no pencil, no eraser, the first reaction is, I couldn't possibly do that. I couldn't possibly draw without being able to control what I do, my roughing out with pencil, and then to erase any mistakes before I commit to the ink. And if I'm really happy with my drawing process and experience in pencil, I don't need to. But if for any reason I'm not happy with my experience of drawing with pencil or using pencil and erasers, if I'm frustrated over creeping perfectionism, as I found I was, if I feel that I spend more time erasing lines than actually drawing ones that are still there at the end, or if I just enjoy that crisp black and white look and want to have a more gestural, perhaps a more looser, a freer style in my drawing, then drawing directly in ink is a great way to go. So let me explain in just a little more detail the way my creativity, the way my drawing skill level And the way my drawings look have all tremendously improved now after a couple of years of drawing only freehand directly in ink. And before I get complaints, let me say I understand that an eraser is not the enemy. An eraser can be a tremendously helpful, creative, and effective drawing tool. We don't just use it to erase mistakes, we also use it to create value, to refine line and edge, either to make them sharp and hard or to make them loose and soft. An eraser can be an incredibly powerful visual tool for really effective drawing. But I need to be honest with myself perhaps and ask, is that why I want to keep drawing in pencil? Because I'm developing wonderful drawing techniques that need an eraser to create their impact? Or is it simply a crutch? Is it a way of making myself feel better, feeling more in control, feeling safer through my drawing experience? And if it's this is not a very good reason. This won't end up being a very satisfying reason to draw the way I do, to be dependent on something which in effect is a way of applying a brake on my creativity, a way of establishing a safety net around what I'm learning and what I'm doing, when if I'm learning to draw, I really want to be learning to take risks and to push myself and to explore all the possibility of marks, however I make them, whatever I make them with. And knowing that I can erase lines can also develop very poor habits of observation. It can make us even a bit lazy about what we do before we start to put marks on the paper with the pencil, because we know we can always erase them. When I draw now directly in pen, I've really had to refine my observation process. I have to make sure I find as much information as I can in my observation before I start to put marks on the paper. Because once they're there, they're there. And this makes me be much more alert, much more mindful, keep much more energy about everything I do from the observation to the marks on the paper. And this is a tremendously important motivation to learn as many skills as we can to the highest level that we can. And these are the sorts of things I'm referring to when I talk about switching to drawing directly in ink, flicked a lot of switches and forced me to think of new techniques, new ways of thinking, or better, more intentional, if you like, more hard-working ways of doing things I already was doing. I thought I was observing quite well. I never realized, though, how much the fact that I knew I had this safety net of the eraser and the pencil under drawing that actually took the edge off my need to observe carefully. That let me be a bit distracted. That let me think, oh, this will do and I'll sort it out later. And while it's not a problem if I correct it later, the problem for me and my drawing development is that I develop poor habits of observation. I develop habits of close enough is good enough. And what this is doing is locking me in to a way of drawing that is less than what I've got the ability, the capability to do. Because I want to be learning in a way that requires me to push myself to be the very best I can in every aspect of my drawing, and that obviously includes my observation. But just because I've seen everything I need to see to draw something well, I still have to be able to put my ink marks on the paper in a way that gives me the maximum chance to put on the paper what I've seen so accurately. And this is particularly challenging early in a drawing. And so it forced me to develop, if you like, my own shorthand way of starting to block out my drawing, but in a way that won't be disfiguring to the overall effect at the end. And so I've learnt to do dots and dashes. I've learnt to do silhouette outlines so that I don't compromise my ability to develop a certain effect further on because of a heavy line. I've learned not to do heavy straight lines all over the place. I've learned how to draw so that I don't draw things over the top of other things or have to leave out things because I didn't leave room on the paper for these objects that perhaps sit in front of what I was drawing at the time. I've had to change my whole approach. I couldn't just start as I did with the pencil in whichever of the boxes that I'd gridded up I wanted to start and almost draw that without regard for the rest of the drawing.
I had to learn to see the drawing as a whole that I developed as a whole, where I kept all my options open as a whole as long as possible. And then towards the end of the drawing, to bring everything together and to tweak and enhance what I've done to really capture the maximum effect of what I was trying to capture in the first place. But still on this idea of how we draw now if we can't erase any lines, the other big change was that I had to develop a way of establishing the scale, the proportions, and keeping them all accurate throughout the entire drawing, regardless of where I was starting, or possibly helped because of where I chose to start. One question I'm regularly asked after my videos is, why don't you rough out the shapes first with a pencil to establish the overall, if you like, big shape sizes, and then draw the detail into those? Pointing out that most drawing courses have this as their method. And my answer always is, because I want to draw directly in pen. I don't want to draw needing a pencil outline. I want to keep all my marks, the marks that I make, directly with a pen, when every mark is going to be there at the end. I'm trying to develop and to use a gestural style, one which flows without having a different way of thinking, and one that forces me to learn accuracy. There's nothing wrong with a pencil outline. There's nothing wrong with roughing in. It just isn't available if we want to learn to draw directly in ink. And I was very motivated to be wanting to do street sketching in Europe directly in ink. And one of the benefits I found is that my lines look more alive, more lively when I'm not tracing over at pencil outline. Because what often happens, and the danger with drawing in pencil first, is that when it comes to the ink, we actually stop drawing from the reference and we start just drawing over the pencil. And when we do that and then erase the pencil, what people see in terms of our finished line work is a derivative drawing. It's not a drawing that we've drawn using the reference and our observation and our creativity. We've erased all the marks and lines that we made that way. What we have left is the drawn over the top of. And particularly if we've been taking extra care to draw very carefully, we can end up with very flat and wooden looking lines that build up to a fairly flat and wooden effect, even if they're accurate. Whereas when I draw directly with ink, when I'm looking at my reference and then filtered through the creative thought processes of my mind, translating that into marks on the paper, directly onto the paper, that process, I believe, adds a certain dynamic impact to the marks we make that we don't erase, that gets to be part of our finished drawing. But I did have to work out a way to put marks and shapes and objects on the paper in a way that grew the whole scene and kept all the proportions correct and kept the overall scale correct, so that if I was drawing at the same size as my reference, all the different parts were the same size as my reference and they didn't get larger as they went up the page or down the page or off to the left or right. And I needed to make sure that all the individual component bits, if they were short and squat in my reference, were short and squat in my drawing. If they were tall and thin in my reference, were tall and thin in the same ratio in my drawing. And because I needed to learn to do this, I worked out ways to do it. And I have a number of videos on how to keep proportions accurate as we draw directly in ink, if you're interested in that. But possibly one of the most important impacts drawing directly in ink had important benefits in terms of impact, was that it got my focus off getting lines and outlines correct. Because when we want to do a pencil outline, we have a great focus on the outline. We have a great focus on the shape, on capturing the shape. We end up with a lot of lines that look fairly cartoon-like because they are basically outlines of a shape, which is what a cartoon is. So if that's our main way of interpreting our reference and starting to establish it on the paper, then we're giving ourselves, if you like, a cartoon-like framework to then add to. When I was no longer working on drawing outlines, when I was choosing a place to start and then growing out in different directions, because I wasn't focused on outlines, I was able to focus on other things. I was able to focus on the effect of what I'm seeing. I was able to focus on edges, not as in things to draw lines around, but as things, the edges, that create a certain effect, a certain way of looking, a certain visual appearance, that I would then have the challenge of creating marks to replicate in some way on my paper. And of course, I wasn't just copying the effects that I could see, but I was also working out how can I change them? How can I enhance them, tweak them, change them completely, improve them for a drawing with the most impact? And because we're drawing directly in ink, with every line, we may as well just push ourselves to be relaxed, be confident, and draw the line we hope to draw and not worry too much, because there's no point being precious. We're not going to get a second go, so we may as well give our first go every chance it's got. And I believe this has certainly helped me to develop a very gestural style, confidence that was, if you like, forced to develop by losing the safety net of an eraser and pencil outline. And one of the more general benefits that my drawing received was just the overall stimulation of my creativity. It forced me to do things so differently. It forced me to change all my techniques. It forced me to change my observation. It forced me to change the way I put marks on the paper. It forced me to find new ways of seeing my objects, not just seeing them accurately, but seeing them at all, and what I saw, and then what I would try to capture, and therefore how I would try to capture it. And this general stimulus of my creativity, of course, had benefits in every element of drawing where creativity is helpful. But not just did I learn to take risks, I also learned to accept imperfections. I learned to accept lines that didn't turn out the way I would have liked first time when I put them on the paper. I learnt to embrace the whole process, that it's not about something that looks perfect at every stage of the drawing process, that the drawing journey ain't over till it's over. It's not over till the last mark's on the paper, and that there are many things I can do, even with marks that aren't quite right, as I develop the overall drawing, that I discover options for either hiding, correcting, or mitigating anything that on initial drawing made me think, that's not right. But I also learnt that many marks that I thought were wrong simply don't matter by the end. They look okay as the drawing has progressed. That this fixation of, is what I've just done right or wrong, and if it's wrong I have to change it straight away, was so unhelpful. It became such a focus that blocked all this other creative thinking, all this other creative focus I could be developing. And instead of learning to do things rightly, to do things to great effect, I was fixated on doing things to not make mistakes, which is not a framework that will develop the best from our creativity into our drawing. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, we're clearly losing the last of our autumn light here, but I hope you found this helpful. I hope it's given you something to think about, made you even feel excited perhaps about experimenting drawing directly in ink. All of the really significant and satisfying things in my own personal drawing development, I believe, have come in the shift from drawing with pencil and erasers in some way to drawing directly in ink, in choosing to put behind me the safety net that, while it protected me from some things, held me back from so much. And I'm so appreciative of all the things I've learned, all the positive things I've learned by embracing the risks and seeing them as actually part of the journey, part of the creative challenge, and ones that have great benefit to bring us in every element of our drawing, from the first observation to the very last marks that we make and the way they look when they're all together. But hey, however you want to draw, and for whatever reason, and whatever you draw and however you think it turns out, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.